Hi there. Thanks very much for coming. Thank you for attending this lecture, and thank you to the university for having me. My name's Mark Brown, and I am the creator of a YouTube channel called Game Maker's Toolkit. Here are some numbers to make me feel better about my life choices. It's a YouTube channel where I talk about game design. So I'm breaking down mechanics. I'm looking at complicated systems. I look at levels and interview level designers. We run a yearly game jam, and there are resources for things like accessibility design or how do you become a game designer, things like that. Big channel, super fun to work on. The reason that I am here today is that your tutor has informed me that you have been working on these projects throughout the year and are now going to have to try and explain what you have been doing to some kind of audience. I forgot who you're pitching it to, but the point being that you've got this stuff that you've been working on that's clever and complicated, and you need to try and express it and communicate it to a sort of typical viewer. And this is something that I do all the time on my channel. Though before I move on, I should say that the information that you're going to get in here is not just going to be useful for school, because if you take this to a career in game design, then you're going to spend all day expressing complicated information, communicating with people from all disciplines in the game development. So you're going to be talking to artists and writers and programmers and testers and other designers to try and take the information out of your brain and give it to other people. So the techniques I'm going to be sharing in this talk should be useful for hopefully your whole career. So just as an example of how this kind of works for me, I'm going to use a video that I made back in January about the Nemesis system, which is from the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games. Basically, there's this really cool system in the game where some of the main enemies are these kind of randomly generated orc captains who go on to have a relationship with the main character based on the interactions that you have. And so they're kind of these recurring characters who keep coming back and remembering things you do. And the idea is that it builds up this kind of dynamic story over the course of the game. And I just thought that's a fascinating experience. I loved playing these games. I thought it was really fun. And I wanted to find out, how does that actually work? And how can I then share that to the viewer? So, I spent a lot of time playing the game, in very specific ways to try and figure out how it's working behind the scenes. I'm reading interviews and watching talks from people at the game's developer at Monolith. I read through like the 10,000 word patent for the system and looked at all the graphs and stuff. And so then my job was like, how can I take all that information that took me weeks and weeks to gather and then express it to people in like 20 minutes. And it's like a YouTube video, so they're like only half paying attention as they're like playing a game or like going to the toilet. So I don't have their full attention. And so my work is really cut out for me. But luckily, over the course of my 7-year career of making videos, I've gathered a lot of techniques and best practices for conveying information in a really easy to understand way. And so that's what I'm going to share with you in this talk. So this is the first technique we're going to be talking about, and I think this is probably the most powerful of them all, the one I use pretty much every day when I'm making videos. If I don't use this, the video falls apart. If I do use this, it probably goes quite well. And the idea is to take to build your entire talk, video, presentation. Just for this talk, I'm going to just say the word video, but you can use this for, essays and other things. To take the video and base it around a question. So I use this all the time on Game Maker's Toolkit. Let me give you some examples. The first one is, the question is, how does Watch Dogs Legion let you play as every NPC in London, and why does that matter? That's the question I want to answer. How does the system work, and what is the actual sort of design experience of that? I was playing Crash Bandicoot 4, and at the beginning of the game, it says, do you want to have lives turned on or not? Which made me think, well, lives in video games are so it's such a weird system now that you can just sort of turn them on and off at your leisure. Maybe ask this question of like, are lives like still relevant in game design, or are they just an sort of antiquated relic of olden times? Why does Celeste feel so good to play? Like, what is going on in the code and the controls and the animation that makes this game such a fun platformer where you feel like you have such a huge amount of control? And how do they make those awesome Hitman levels? And so the nice thing about this is that it's based on something that I am genuinely personally curious about. I'm playing Hitman and I'm like, man, how do they make these levels? I want to know. I want to know. And so that really helps me make the videos. Maybe it's a complicated system that I want to explain. And so the question is, how does this system work, like the Nemesis system? It might be a problem that needs solving. So I made a video called, how do we make talking as much fun as shooting? And so it's this problem of dialogue systems in games aren't as much fun as just shooting people with a gun. What sort of solutions can we find to make talking more mechanically interesting? So it's a problem that needed solving. Or it might be an argument that needs settling. So, should Dark Souls have an easy mode? It's an argument that keeps coming up. I'm not going to settle that argument, but I can at least provide my own thoughts and give people the kind of tools and thought processes to come up with their own opinion on that subject. The nice thing about this technique of basing things around a question is that I think it's really powerful for both the audience and the writer. For the audience, it kind of focuses them on, they kind of know what they're getting into. They know that this video is going to be an answer to this question. And so even though there may be tangents and explanations and stories and all sorts of other things, they know that it's always going to get back to that question, and the video at large is going to be an answer to that question. It's kind of like a sort of guiding star that helps them get through the video. But from the writer's perspective, it's also very good for kind of focusing the writer on a specific goal. As an example, just as a sort of like, imagine I gave you a prompt for making a video for GMTK, and I said, make me a video about Super Mario Brothers. That's a very broad topic. You get a lot of freedom there, but you might be like, I don't know where to begin. I don't know where to start. I don't know how to structure this. But if I said, make me a video that answers the question, how are Mario levels structured? Well, now you know exactly where to start, right? I'm going to go and play some levels, break them down into pieces, see what's happening. You know how to introduce that video. You know what the structure is going to be. Providing this sort of question gives it a nice focus and a goal to go for. So technique number 2 is thinking about a strong introduction to a video. This is obviously such a really important part because it captures the viewer's interest and engagement, and it provides a sort of foundation for the video. They're going to know now what this video is about, what it's not about, what to expect. It's kind of getting them into the right mindset to understand this video. This is typically where I just ask the question or set it up. For example, this is from the Crash Bandicoot Lives video. I literally just say, is a live system still relevant game design or just an antiquated relic of the arcade era? Now the viewer knows what this video is going to be about, and they've got this question in their mind, and every time I say something they can bring it back to this question and ask it again and see how the information relates. And so we're kind of starting off where we want to go. Another technique I use quite a lot in introductions to videos is to try and explain why the thing I'm about to tell you is important or interesting or worth caring about. So one of my very first videos I made was about how Half-Life 2 teaches many of its mechanics in this kind of invisible and subtle way. But I actually start the video by talking about Dead Space. And the reason for that is I wanted to show how Dead Space teaches a mechanic in a really kind of obvious and slightly patronizing way where it's constantly repeating the same information over and over again. And the idea for this was that the video is kind of setting like a baseline of this is how tutorials in games usually are. Or maybe this is a slightly bad example, I don't know. But it's this is kind of a baseline, and it's the video is essentially now saying, okay, let me show you a better way. And so now when I talk about the Half-Life examples, it's always going back from that baseline of like, well, this is what it could be, but this is how Valve has done it in what I'm arguing is a better way. And it kind of sets the viewer up to understand why this is relevant and interesting and sort of worth caring about, rather than doing it at the end and being like, okay, so I've showed you this whole tutorial from Half-Life, here's why it was good, because now the viewer's kind of got to retroactively remember everything I said. It's better to set them up in that way. Technique 3 is about defining terms. It's just a kind of an easy, quick one, but it's worth talking about, which is at the beginning of the video, usually after the intro, just kind of telling the viewer, what are we actually talking about in here? What do I mean when I say the main terms from the video? So in the lives system video, I go into what exactly do I mean by a lives system, because the viewer could have a slightly different idea of what that means. They might bring their own sort of baggage and their own connotations to it, and if those their connotations and my definition of lives are slightly out of sync, then we're gonna spend the whole video out of sync. And I think there's nothing worse than the viewer just not understanding the video simply because they think you're talking about something else entirely. This is also a good moment to maybe explain what this video won't be about, of just being like, okay, this is a video about user interfaces, but I'm specifically talking about the heads-up display. I'm only talking about stuff that appears on top of the gameplay. And now the viewer knows why you're not mentioning other types of UI, they're on the same page as you. Okay, technique 4 is about flow and structure. And this is like really, really critical and really important. It's about understanding the ideas and the sections and sequences of your video and what order they are placed in and how quickly you're moving between them and things like that, to try and it's the difference between holding the viewer's hand and gently leading them through your argument, or just kind of chucking them into a room full of books and saying, you figure it out. Like, we want to, when we've only got a few minutes, 10 minutes, say, on a YouTube video to give someone some information, we need to hold their hand as they move through it, especially with video, because with text, if you're misunderstanding something, you can kind of jump back a little bit and reread it, or you can read it at a slower pace. But a video is just kind of going, and if the viewer starts to get lost, then they're just going to click off because they don't know what the video is about anymore. So you've got to structure it in a certain way. This can be really hard to get right and normally involves many rewrites and changes. Let me give you an example from a video called Who Gets to Be Awesome? This is a video about power fantasies in games and the different ways that they can be sort of given to the player. And I want to show you how this is split up into different parts. So part 1 is, I start by saying that there are 2 different ways to offer power fantasies to the player. And then so we go into part 2, which, as I say, one way to do it is to simply give the fantasy to the player. And so I explore this idea, I sort of, almost define the term, and use examples and a relevant quote from a developer. And then I move on to, okay, the other way is to make the player earn the fantasy. I then explore this idea, also with examples and quotes. Again, just kind of defining these 2 different terms and these 2 different concepts, because they're very different. Then to part 4, now I'm going into, okay, why would we use one over the other? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? And ultimately comes to the conclusion that there are huge advantages to, giving the fantasy. There are advantages to making the player earn the fantasy, but they also have disadvantages, and they're kind of, one's disadvantage is the other's advantage. They're kind of, they're incompatible, and so there's a bit of a conundrum there, which kind of sets up for part 5, which is finding a middle ground, other solutions that are somewhere kind of a best of both worlds, and give the player the ability to earn and sort of give it the fantasy and earn it at the same time. And each one of those is its own little sort of mini section, but we sort of move through them before moving to some kind of conclusion. Now, there are loads of different ways to structure this video. Trust me, I've tried most of them. This is a really hard one to get right. It's quite subtle little changes, just about like how I introduce each thing and the order and the speed of it. But this was the way that I found was the most kind of satisfying and the most effective. because I felt like it led the viewer on, I'm so used to talking about players, led the viewer on a journey of introducing these two types, and they get them, they understand what they are, but they also understand how they're incompatible. And so they're at this position now in the video where they're like, cool, I can see why you'd want to earn it, but I can see why you want to give it. They're quite incompatible. And then I'm like, well, there's a better way. I've given you A, I've given you B, now here's C. And we move on to the sort of the real meat of the video, which is the sort of middle ground solution. So that the viewer is perfectly positioned to understand the point of the video before I deliver them the sort of the main goods. And I spend a huge amount of time on this, on videos. I will write the video and kind of split it up into chunks of like, okay, this is a whole chunk about the pros, and this is a whole chunk about the cons. This is a whole chunk about potential fixes. This is a chunk with devil's advocate. And I think of them as almost like big puzzle pieces, and some bits connect, some bits don't connect. And I've got to just move them around. There's no perfect picture, but I can find the best possible picture and just spend a lot of time moving them around. And then once that's done, I can kind of add those sentences in between to just kind of create a flow between the different chunks. Technique 5 is about layering on complexity. This is more for videos where I'm kind of explaining something complex, like a system, like the Nemesis system or the system in Watch Dogs Legion, where I want to, for example, with the Nemesis system, I want to explain to the viewer how this system works. If I just jumped right in at the deep end, it would be too much. There's too much going on there. So I want to start with just the most basic version of it. An orc remembers your actions and then brings it up in the next time you see them again, right? We've just got the most basic version of the system. And then I can layer on, okay, but there's more complex things. It might be, we can talk about humiliation and fleeing and shaming and cheating death. And then now we've got an idea of, okay, Talion, the main character, and an orc. We've got that relationship. Now I can explore an orc's extended relationship in the hierarchy of overlords and war chiefs. And now I can talk about Talion's other relationships with his recruits, and then I can talk about the recruits, the relationships between those two sort of bands of characters, and we're getting into interpersonal relationships. And it's like, if the viewer is following along, they're going to get it because I'm just introducing one bit at a time. They've got that baseline knowledge now, and then we can move it on a bit more. And now their baseline has moved up, and we can add more and more. You might need to state some obvious stuff at the beginning to kind of get everyone on the same page, but I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end. Technique 6 is about recapping, reaffirming, and concluding. This is a pretty simple one, but it's just after each major section of the video, taking a moment to simply state what I just said, but in a more quick and concise way. The idea being that if the viewer has kind of lost concentration or lost what I'm trying to say and doesn't quite understand what the video is about anymore, they're starting to fall off. They're starting to, their fingers going towards the, close video button or click on something on the sidebar. This gives me a time to say, we just, that was a whole bunch of examples there. And the viewer's like, oh, I guess we were just talking about examples. They're kind of brought back on. I've gotten them back into the fray, and they're more connected to the material. And of course, at the end, there's lots of opportunities to conclude by wrapping everything up, taking the sort of 20-minute video and trying to say it in 1 minute. And hopefully the viewer doesn't go, well, why didn't I just watch a 1-minute version of this? They've gotten all that information sort of recapped for them in a nice sort of convenient way. And so to take a second to recap and reaffirm what we've done so far. So far I've been talking about kind of techniques for the overarching structure of the video. We've got the question that we're going to be asking, we've got the intro, we've got the sort of defining the terms, the flow and the structure, and then having moments to recap, reaffirm, and then conclude the whole thing. So we kind of got the structure of the video now, but now I want to move on to some more specific techniques for teaching individual bits and bobs, and for because the thing is that everyone learns in a different way. That much is obvious, and so I want to try and touch on as many of them as possible to help make these videos and explanations more understandable. So the first one is using images. This is something I do all the time because I personally am very much a visual learner. If I just read stuff or you tell me stuff, it probably goes in one ear and out the other. But having images of maps and graphs and stuff is a really good way for me to remember things. I can often conjure up that image in my head at a later date, much better than I can just conjure up dates and information like that. So here are some examples of ones that I've made for GMTK videos. We've got a map from Doom Eternal. I made a video about how a single encounter works in that game, and so having a map allows for me to sort of orientate the player in the level, and to constantly bring this map back. I can show where enemies spawn in and where items are and where the entrance and exit is, and they're on the same page because they know where they are in sort of 3D space. Then we've got the state flowchart from the guards in Metal Gear Solid, just showing how they move between the idle, combat, and search states, and what triggers those changes. I explain it in voiceover in the video, but having it on screen like that allows the viewer to kind of sort of structure the text that's coming in, the voice that's coming in, and sort of lay it out in a more foundational way in this video. This is showing a trajectory of a projectile in Cuphead, just a way of, if you've got something on screen where you want to show someone a very specific part of it, highlighting it is a good way, because it kind of really makes sure we're guiding the viewer's eye to the very specific thing we want to show. We don't want them to be looking at the dragon or Cuphead. We're looking at this projectile, and we want to see the sort of history of its movement. So this highlights that information that would otherwise be kind of semi-invisible. And they've got a graph showing jump heights in platformers. And the nice thing about this is that I kind of define the graph of how it works. Okay, we've got the height time, we've got the climb, the hang time, and the fall. And now I can keep all of that information on screen, but then change the arc for the different games. And to really show the viewer, okay, this one is different to Mario, is different to Cuphead, is different to Shovel Knight, and so on and so forth. A few more. Here's a puzzle from the Talos Principle. Explaining this in just words would be almost impossible, but showing an image, image says 1,000 words, so on and so forth, was really a clear way of expressing it. This is modeling the AI's view cone in Splinter Cell, just showing how it's used in the game. This is a level generation algorithm for the game Spelunky. I wanted to show how that works. And this is a very complicated game called Event Zero, where it's got this whole system where you have an AI you talk to. You type anything into the keyboard and it will then try and give you an answer. And it's based on a pretty clever algorithm where it's looking at the text that you've given it and trying to find things that it can relate to. And so I wanted to have a system where I could sort of show it breaking down the sentence, and there's a whole lot going on there. These are usually based on sketches that I have made as I'm researching. I use them to help me understand what the video or the system in the game is like, or what my opinion is of a system, or all sorts of different things. I'm just always constantly doing doodles and sketches, and so they help me, so I assume they'll help other people, and so I just sort of make them more pretty for YouTube. I think it's worth remembering that an image isn't immediately or automatically more understandable than text. If I just throw this on screen, it's wow, what's going on here? There's so much going on. The viewer can easily be lost. So you've got to do the work to make it clear and concise and easy to read. So I think in the video for this, I actually animate it sort of bit by bit. So it kind of only a small amount of information is revealed at once. So I can kind of talk it through as it comes in. You can remove unnecessary information or visual clutter, use symbols, use color, anything really to make it more legible and easy to understand. I want to take a quick moment to talk about my Zelda graphs. So basically I was analyzing the dungeons in the Zelda games, and I wanted a way to kind of take my personal experience of playing the dungeons and show it in a visual manner, and also a way that could compare between the different dungeons. It took a lot of iteration and work, but I was pretty happy with where it landed. I won't go too in depth into how it works, but I think the important thing I want to say is that it was important that the graphs show information that I thought was really relevant to my experience. So when I'm playing Zelda dungeons, the things that might be different between one dungeon and the other would be, how many options do I have currently? And so this graph shows that by the width of the graph. This is kind of the more options you have. And it's like, how much backtracking do I have to do? Well, these long vertical lines show you going back to earlier parts in the dungeon, stuff like that. The idea being that I can kind of show two graphs side by side, and you get the idea that like the one on the left is very thin, which suggests that you're kind of only doing one thing at a time, and there's not those long vertical lines like there are on the right, so there's less backtracking. And so I don't have to, the viewer doesn't have to go through the graph and like really parse it and understand it. They can just kind of see it at a glance. So trying to make visual information that can be understood very, very quickly, of like, especially with comparisons of like, this is complicated, this is simple, or this is big, this is small, it gives the viewer that clear understanding. Technique 8 is about using stories, analogies, and examples. We use this all the time in life to just kind of help people understand things by using stuff that they understand from their real life. So some examples I used from the video on the Nemesis system. I needed a way to explain how this storytelling system works differently to other dynamic storytelling in games. A lot of the time, there's very much a sort of predefined structure to the story, and then you kind of move through it, perhaps linearly, or taking different paths through it. But either way, the point is that it's predefined. But I wanted to show how in the Nemesis system it's more about an orc gives an idea, and then it kind of, you respond to that, and then they respond to you, and it's layering on top of each other. So it's this kind of improvisational kind of way. Also, the video is kind of built around this story of this character called Arcaro. I'm talking about how I just mentioned that this guy exists and he broke my sword and killed me. And that was used as an example of an interaction that can happen with an orc. And then I bring it back again and I say I go back and killed him. And that's an example of revenge. And so I'm using him throughout the video as examples of various different things, but ultimately it all adds up to a story. And so, the video, towards the end, I'm saying, this game allows for really interesting stories, and hey, I've just given you an example throughout the video that you followed along and hopefully found interesting, and that's an example of a story. So I'm kind of it was important to kind of layer it throughout the video so it didn't get like boring to just suddenly be like, right, let me sit down and tell you a story. It was being used throughout the whole video, and it did double duty as example and story. And just a quick note on examples. It can be very good to bring in like other video games and be like, this is a bit like Mario, or this is very different to Mario, because hopefully the viewer has played that game and can bring the experiences and memories and connotations of that to understand what you're talking about. The big challenge, of course, is that you've got to make sure that the person has played that game, or at least is very much aware of it, or else the example won't work as an example, which is something I get in trouble with GMTK sometimes, where I'm kind of using the same games over and over again, but they're just very good, strong examples. If I want to talk about a difficult game, I want to talk about feeling those sensations of challenge and mastery and stuff, I'll talk about Dark Souls, and I might use it over and over again, but everyone kind of has that understanding of what Dark Souls feels like, and so they can bring that in. Technique number 9 is color. This isn't one I use a lot, but it can help with the video sometimes. So in the video I talked about before about giving and earning the power fantasy, that's two very different ways of doing it, and I wanted to talk about advantages of one and disadvantages of another, and talk about quotes from developers who have made games that lean closer to one or the other. And throughout the video, I'm jumping back and forth between the two. And so to help the viewer kind of know which type I'm talking about at any time, I use these colors. Everything to do about giving the fantasy is in blue. Everything about earning the fantasy is in red. So the quotes are in red or blue, and the title cards are in red and blue. And then when I get to the bit about the solutions that strike a balance in the middle, I switch to purple, which is a mix of red and blue. And it's all that kind of visual shorthand for the viewer to understand, where are we in the video? What are we talking about? How do these ideas come together in a natural way? Point 10 is about avoiding unnecessary details. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to give some unnecessary details for this section. So I was working on a video about Pac-Man, how the ghosts work, how their AI is programmed. I made this cool visual where it kind of shows a line where each ghost is targeting. But then I ran into this problem where the pink ghost has a bug that causes its target to glitch out and go in the wrong place, specifically when Pac-Man is moving upwards. It's just a programming bug. Mistake. I decided, I debated whether or not to include this. It would just I felt like it would be kind of time consuming and boring and break the flow of the video where I'm suddenly, I'm talking about the red ghost, the orange ghost, the pink ghost. Hold on a second, I've got to talk about this bug. And it was I felt like it was kind of irrelevant. I didn't want to talk about it. But I knew that people would kind of correct me in the comments. But I ultimately made the decision I'm not going to include it. Yes, people did correct me in the comments, but I think it was the right choice because it made the video flow better. There are ways to get around this sort of stuff. You can use language like, in most cases this happens, or typically, or almost always, to kind of suggest that there might be weird outliers in there. You could also just make a quick offhand reference to it, like, oh, there's also a bug, more information in the description below, where you can provide people with an additional resource if they're interested. I've also taken to using footnotes sometimes. So this is a video about Mass Effect, and I'm talking about how you're talking to this character called Ashley, and I'm like, well, depending on a decision you made in the previous game, that character could actually be called Kaiden, is a completely different person. I don't want to get into this in the video. Again, it would break the flow. So I just put a little footnote up on the screen and then just, explain essentially this in the comments or in the description at the bottom. Technique 11 is to play devil's advocate. Essentially, if you're making an argument about something, there's almost always going to be a counter argument or different opinions, things that maybe run counter to what you're saying. And you can try and get in front of these and answer them in your video, in the video itself. Now, this is just generally good practice. It's, makes your argument more compelling and complete. But I think it can be very useful for sort of focus for a video, because the viewer can get kind of distracted in that they're listening along and they're like, well, hold on, what about this? What about in this context? Or I don't think this person has even considered X. But if you can take a second, appropriate point of video to be like, well, you might be thinking right now, why don't I just do it like this? However, here's why I don't. The viewers they feel that they're connecting to the material, and they go, okay, now I can get back into sort of listening and focusing on what you're talking about. And then technique number 12 is about knowing your audience. So, if I wanted to talk about space, I'd have a very different keynote presentation depending on whether I'm talking to a room full of NASA astronauts or a room full of school children, right? We don't want to make stuff that's too complicated for our audience to understand and to use loads of jargon and sort of assumptions and expectations about their knowledge that they just don't have. And equally, we don't want to tell them stuff they already know and bore them and patronize them. I find this very challenging just because of how many different types of people watch GMTK videos. I have people who just play games as a hobby, and their only understanding of how games are made comes from YouTube channels like mine. But I also have people watch GMTK who have been in the industry for years and have, made loads of games and have way more experience than me. So I shouldn't be telling them anything, really. And so balancing the two can be very tricky. For example, I did make this video about artificial intelligence a few years back. And I had this whole section I'd been working on, maybe 5-10 minutes, where I went into the technical side of AI, things like behavior trees and finite state machines and goal-oriented action planning and pathfinding algorithms and so on. I explained how AI technically works, but ultimately decided that it was far too complicated for a sort of typical gamer audience. It would go over their head. It would either take forever to explain it in a way that would make sense, or they would just kind of get lost. But on the other hand, it would be too basic for anyone who's actually working in AI. They'll be like, I've heard these terms, you're not teaching me anything new, this is pointless. And so it didn't really serve anyone, and just destroyed the flow of the video. So I had to make the decision to cut it. So you've really got to do your best to try and figure out who your audience is. If it's very small and specific, like exactly who you're talking to, like I'm making this for programmers, then you can tailor it to them. And, you can have those assumptions about the type of things that they might already know. But if it's more broad, or you don't know your audience, you're going to need to find some kind of middle ground, and maybe accept that there are going to be some things that the viewer is already going to know or doesn't know or whatever, and you're going to have to work around that. It's not too bad. You can the main thing to do is just kind of acknowledge it. And you can almost sort of flatter their ego to be like, hey, if you're a game designer, then you already know this, but let me just explain it to the noobs in the audience. Not like that, but and then the game designers watching will be like, okay, yeah, I'm cool. I'll stick around. Like acknowledging it is kind of the way to go. And so I want to just take a moment to conclude and recap and reaffirm by showing you how I used pretty much all of these techniques on a single video, the Nemesis system video I've talked about a number of times now, using this as a sort of lodestar throughout the video. And so, number one, a question. Well, the video is based around a question. How does the Nemesis system tell stories? It was a question I was interested in, and I wanted to answer it for the viewer. And I think the video's title is like, How the Nemesis System Tells Stories, which is a question just without a question mark, basically. Then we get to the intro. The main goal of the intro was to kind of explain why I think the system is really cool. So I kind of give some examples of it being used, and just kind of tell you that it does all these interesting things. And so hopefully you'll be interested to learn how it actually works. In terms of defining terms, there's a few things I use in the video. One of the things I just talk about is how I don't want to keep saying Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War the entire time, so we're just going to call it Mordor. So that's one way I sort of define terms and kind of get everyone on the same page. Flow and structure. Well, this video was all about introducing the player to the system. And so the first thing to do was to talk about how it makes stories, just like fundamentally, technically, how it makes stories. But then go on to how it makes good stories. So now I'm talking about how it, the design of it is to try and make stories that are memorable and interesting and unique and things like that. And so and then I talk about why it hasn't shown up in other games. And there were loads of other versions of this video where I talked about things in different orders, but ultimately decided to try and put it in these nice two big buckets of like how it tells stories and how it tells good stories. And that those kind of titles that didn't end up necessarily in the video, but it helped me understand where information should go. Layering on complexity, as I talked about earlier, very much so. This video was just about doling it out bit by bit, starting with the most basic version of the system and then adding on complexity as we go. Recapping and concluding, I try and sort of recap and wrap up each section before moving on to make things clear. So for example, there's a line like, literally say, so hopefully you can now see why I make the link between Mordor and improv, and then explain that a little bit more. Gets people on the same page, brings it back to things I said earlier, constantly bringing people back into the fold if they're feeling a little bit lost, and making sure they know what's going on. And then there's a nice big sort of recap at the end where a sort of conclusion where I wrap up everything I've been talking about. 7 is using images. There's a lot of images in here. Basically, I went through the script and tried to highlight the things that I thought would be the most difficult for the player, for the viewer to get their head around just through voice alone, and made a note of all those, and then went off and made graphs and charts and maps and things like that for things that I could show on screen. And then stories and analogies, as I talked about earlier. This is the technique I probably used the most in this video. So there's the analogy of improvisational theatre. There's examples. Every time I talk about something that could happen in the game, I show an example of it happening with the voiceover. And there's the story of our Cora the Stitch and other characters that are kind of weaved throughout. Colour, I do actually use this one, which is that everything to do with Talion and his recruits is in blue, and everything to do with the enemy orcs is in red. And so I keep that colour, that visual language up throughout the video for the most part. Just a quick side note is that I try to always use red and blue for kind of competing elements rather than the more typical red and green, simply because of colorblind issues. Red and green can be indistinguishable for a lot of people with colorblindness, whereas red and blue are pretty much always vastly different. In terms of avoiding unnecessary details, I mean, this is a very complicated system. There's loads of things I could mention and little quirks that I decided not to. I guess the main one was that I slightly lied with my story. There are things that happen in the story that I omitted. There are things that I engineered to happen simply because the narrative that I constructed in the video I thought was more conducive to learning and more interesting and informative than the truth, which was a bit more messy and would require me to go off on weird little tangents that just didn't really serve the video. So, it's a lie, but it's a good one. It's a white lie. Playing devil's advocate, there's not too much in this video, but kind of the main one was talking about how the other types of story generation systems in other games and how the Nemesis system differs. So if the viewer is thinking about one type of game, hopefully I bring it up and be like, look, it's different to that. This is why it's interesting in its own way. And then for knowing my audience, well, I assumed most people clicking on this thumbnail would have played the Shadow of Mordor or War games. So I tried to speed through the basic definition of how the game works and not, bore people with really, really simple stuff. But some of that had to be done just because I don't know that every single person has played. And there we go. And I finally just wanted to kind of wrap up by mentioning how I used pretty much all of the techniques in this talk on this talk. So, one of the main things is I'm constantly moving the slides around into a different order to try and find the best flow. So this wasn't always the 1 through 12 wasn't always this order. It was, in different places, trying to find the right way to kind of layer on complexity over time and find a good flow and make things in a sort of sensible order. I tried to use lots of examples and stories and analogies. So there's the idea of like being led through the hand, trying to use that, all the puzzle pieces to help you understand what's going on in my head when I say these things. I tried to recap and reaffirm things. There was a little moment when I sort of said, here's what we've learned so far, then concluded everything by wrapping it up with the Nemesis system. Things like that. I'm always trying to be as clear as possible. I find that to be my sort of main goal through GMTK, and so trying to use all these techniques is what I try to do no matter what I'm doing, whether it's a video or a talk or whatever. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I've been Mark Brown from Game Maker's Toolkit. Hopefully it was interesting, and if you have any questions, go ahead. Thanks.